Yeah, we're alive.
We're live now. Okay, welcome. Welcome to the Red Room. We have a special guest tonight. He was here.
Did you lost the sound?
Problem here. Okay. I think it's okay now. So again, welcome to the Red Room. And welcome RPGPundit for the second time.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you for coming. You were here less than a year.
I was gonna say maybe 9 months ago.
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
eight, 9 months.
But a lot has changed since then.
Yeah, that's true. Especially on this side.
Yes, you were unknowns the last time that I was here, and
Yeah.
now you've become kind of famous in the OSR.
The channel had started recently. Then I remember that was probably the second month when you were here. We were talking about especially the Invisible College, though you had written
Sword and Caravan.
You were
Yeah,
still.
I think that was just before Sword and Caravan came out. It hadn't been published yet, so
no, you were still looking for a publisher. I think I remember that.
Oh, really? Is that far back? Okay, wow.
Yeah,
so that might have been more than. I don't remember when Sword and Caravan came out now, actually.
I remember that we interviewed Chris
When you
Miller.
publish like 125 books, it starts to become a bit of a blur.
Yeah, well,
I think it came out in May. Okay, so yeah, okay, maybe I was still 9 months ago. 9 months ago,
yeah,
I was
probably.
definitely not still looking for a publisher.
Yeah, it probably was right at the time when you decided, right before you went with Chris.
Yeah, I guess.
That's it, because we interviewed Chris Miller maybe 1 month after that, and he was starting. I remember he was talking about finding the right art and looking for the best art for it, and so it was not a long time after that.
Right.
Okay. Meanwhile, Sword and Caravan was published, and how is that going?
It's doing very well, actually. I mean, I'm quite pleased, at least. It's had a very, very good critical review in that I still haven't heard any really serious criticism of any point in it, right? I mean, even some of my other products that have done very well, like, I mean, Star Adventure is a big fan favorite, but there are a lot of people that say, oh, you should have had robots in there, right? Or something like that, something that you could say is a serious criticism. Sword and Caravan has been selling well, and it hasn't had anybody suggest in any major element that was wrong or missing to it. It's it's already what is it, an Electrum bestseller? Yeah, it's an Electrum bestseller still. It's probably going to hit gold pretty soon here. And a full 5-star rating. So it's been quite popular. And I'm glad, because I wasn't sure how much people would want a kind of more, to coin the phrase, exotic setting, but it seems to have caught the attention of a lot of people.
And since then we published Social Encounters, which is not just for Sword and Caravan, right? Can be used. Right.
Yeah, I'm very surprised by how much of a response that product has gotten, because I mostly did it, and I mean, Chris would say this, he'd attest to this. I mostly wrote Social Encounters as like some little product that was going to be just to keep momentum and attention on Sword and Caravan. But because of the mechanics of it, it's not really set in anything. It's on adventure or something like that. It's a set of rules for how you can use an old school system to govern complex social encounters, which is the old 2d6 die modified by charisma reaction rule, right? That is what you have in Sense, the red box D&D set, it's, you know, when you encounter a monster, you can roll to see the reaction of that monster, if it's hostile or not. Expanded into human interactions where you use a system of modifiers based on the traits of the people you're interacting with and the environmental factors of other conditions that are at play to create modifiers and give you specific results. So it's a bunch of tables about how to do that. And then, like, you know, it's a guide of how to do that. And then there's a bunch of examples in the book for things like haggling, intimidation, debates, presenting yourself at court, trying to recruit people, all kinds of things. And it's only about 20 pages long. We only released it initially as a PDF. And I was surprised that it very quickly jumped up to copper and then silver bestseller, and that there were a bunch of people who were calling for it to have a print edition. And because I guess they saw that it had this kind of real utility that you can use in any fantasy environment, you know, and with a little bit of modification in any OSR environment, for all kinds of these sorts of social interplays. And finally, I brought this to Chris's attention. He decided to publish a print-on-demand version. So now you can not just get the PDF is only $3.99, but you can get for $9.99 the standard color book, right? Or for $11.99, you can get the premium color book, which I think is just crazy. It's a 20-page book, and there's a premium option. So there you go. It's had some very surprising reactions.
I only bought it today, so I was checking it. In fact, the only thing that connects it to this to the game is basically illustrations and a few examples. I think the rest you can just.
It's just some of the contextual examples. So, for example, in the part where I talk about, like, in some places, like maybe where there's something about legal cases, I might say in the modifiers, right? This is a -2 if the player character is not a Muslim and he's in a Muslim city or something like that, right? Or a +2 if he is a Muslim and it's a Muslim city, or stuff like that sort of thing that you might see on the Silk Road. But it's very tiny. Everything else, you could totally use those same rules for a Greyhawk game. You know,
even that you could adapt, right, to the setting if you wanted. Instead of a Muslim city, it could be anything related to the setting.
Yeah, and remember that all of those specific examples, I mean, those are some of the most common social interactions you do in Dungeons and Dragons play, but they're just templates, right? And also the book starts by giving you the core structure of how to make those yourself. So if there's an example of some other social interaction that I didn't include, you can take that same template as a DM and make that social interaction and change the specific modifiers to your setting, right? To details about personalities or cultures or events in your setting that would help make it easier to apply.
Are we starting to have questions there?
We just have a comment. Judd says that he would also like to see a song dynasty setting from Pandit someday.
Well, I think that could certainly happen. I mean, Sword and Caravan is set during the same time as the song Dynasty, and one of the sections in Sword and Caravan is about the song. Even though they're not on the Silk Road at that point, they're quite far away from it. But because they're such an important part of that time period and that civilization, I had to include some details on them. You know, the song were basically the most advanced civilization that ever existed in human history until the Industrial Revolution. They were the most sophisticated culture of all of known human history until, you know, we really got the Western Enlightenment civilization going. You know, until then, and they were quite amazing. And there's, you know, some details about their amazing things about them in the Sword and Caravan book. And in my next book that I'm going to come out for Sword and Caravan, I will have a few little tidbits expanding that, because in the Sword and Caravan book, I wrote about some of the incredible inventions that the song had come up with in the 12th century, including things like gunpowder and all of that, right? But I've uncovered details about some more of them that I didn't include in the original one. So in my next Sword and Caravan book, which is going to be a book of NPCs, I'm going to include there the mechanics for Song Dynasty hand grenades and Song Dynasty, basically what would be high explosive artillery. They had both of those things in the 1100s, and it's just quite remarkable.
When you say a book of NPCs, you mean fictional NPCs or
no,
real?
My next product for Sword and Caravan that I'm pretty close now to getting it done, but I've had a few delays, is going to be a fairly big book. It's going to be about, I don't know, it might be 100 pages. And it's going to be a book of biographies. Every single historical character that is mentioned in Sword and Caravan is going to get a short biography of, several paragraphs, right? Not super detailed, but definitely covering the chronology of their life story. And they're going to get full stats, OSR stats, Lion and Dragon style, and adventure cues for how they incorporate into the Silk Road campaign. And then there's also going to be an expanded kind of more adventure-focused Silk Road timeline of events in the back of the book, because there's a timeline in the Sword and Caravan book, but that one is about like major historical events, and that's fine, but it's not focused on, if the players are in such and such place, this is happening there, right? So there's going to be a more detailed timeline. And there'll be a few other bits like the Song Dynasty hand grenade. And because the one thing that people have been complaining about Sword and Caravan is that, this is set in the same time as the assassins, right? The Hashashin. And I included them as an opponent. I have stat blocks for them as bad guys, but there isn't a class for them. And that's obviously because you can't really, if you're playing them as is, you couldn't really have an assassin being part of the adventuring party, right? They were an order that had a whole big deal going on. And they're not going to be just going around, they could be undercover or something, but they just wouldn't fit, right? They're not a good PC class, but people kept insisting. So I said, okay, fine. So I'm putting in the PC class for the assassin in this upcoming book, which I think the book will be called Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road or something like that.
So that's interesting. Did you find difficult to stat historical figures?
Well, it takes a bit of thinking about, right? And part of the thing is that obviously at different points in time, certain historical figures are very different. They're very different people too, right? So in each case, what I decided to do, I based it on the chronology chapter of Sword and Caravan. So a historical figure is statted out from the time of their first appearance in the book chronology of Sword and Caravan. So, for example, there's a whole bunch of them that show up in the period from 1186 to 1192. That's kind of the bulk of them. And it gives you a look at them at that point in time. And that's, Richard Lionheart and Saladin show up at that point. And that's good because it's both of them at the peak of their abilities. Saladin dies shortly after, and Richard leaves the Holy Land after that. So but there are others where it's a little bit trickier. Like there was the one that I had to. There's only one historical character I did 2 stat blocks for, and that was Genghis Khan, because Genghis Khan has such a long career in the Silk Road. And Genghis Khan at the beginning, when he was Temujin, right, before he became the Great Khan, is obviously going to be quite different from Genghis Khan, the devastator of the Silk Road, in his later years, right? So I had to do like early hip Temujin, the one that could gyrate and everything, and then fat Genghis Khan at near the end, like young and old Elvis were very different from each other.
Yeah, that's a very well. Silk Road allows for a very large timeline. So exactly how broad is it?
Well, the timeline of Sword and Caravan is specifically set in the period that starts with the Third Crusade. So it starts around 1190, and it ends with the Mongol devastation of the Silk Road in like 1220 to 1222. So it's the campaign book itself, Sword and Caravan, covers about a 30-year period. And you can play at any time during that timeline, right? And so that means you can play during the third, in the Middle East, you can play during the Third Crusade, during the German Crusade, and during the Fifth Crusade, if you wanted to do a Crusader type campaign. But you can also have any time after the Third Crusade ends in 1192, you can have Westerners, because of the peace with Saladin, begin to travel the Silk Road, and then they end up being able to explore these incredible cities that nobody had ever been to before in the West.
Yeah, it almost probably works very well with almost like fantasy, right? Because most of the historically accurate settings are based in Europe.
Yeah, and I mean, there are cities, it's incredible because in 1192, for example, the largest city in the world was the city of Merv, which is a city no one knows about now. It was on the Silk Road. It had well over 1 million inhabitants, right? And Nishapur was almost as big. It had nearly 1 million inhabitants, right? And the reason we don't even know about them now, as opposed to say Cordoba, which we still know about, for example, and which is also a big city at that time, is because Merv and Nishapur were both wiped right off the face of the map by Genghis Khan. In the case of Nishapur, he tore everything down and left only a giant pyramid of the skulls of every man, woman, and child of the city there. So that's all gone. And the average person wouldn't recognize those names. So when you look at the gazetteer of the Silk Road, maybe if you're like, if you're a regular kind of Western person, I mean, nowadays at least, you'll probably know, you'll know Jerusalem, you'll know maybe Damascus, you'll probably know Baghdad, and you'll kind of know about some of these other places in the Middle East. But then once you start hitting past the Zagros Mountains, it's hardly anyone is familiar with that and what it was like. And I detail every single city with all of the characteristics I thought would be interesting to set each city apart from the other, and in terms of adventure possibilities.
People who are playing Sword and Caravan are playing mostly Westerns or Muslims?
That's a good question. I mean, the campaign is set up that you can do either. And in fact, you can also play, like Chinese characters, or you can play tribesmen like the Uyghur or the Uzbeks. I think that probably the most common campaign is going to be one of European Westerners, either crusaders or merchants, who have come to the Middle East and are going to participate in events there or go and explore along the Silk Road. But you also probably have a lot of mixed groups, especially because it is an OSR game, right? So if you start out with a party of like Frenchmen or Genoese or Pisans or whatever, and you start going down the Silk Road, eventually some of those people are going to die. And then you either have to like, okay, invent another European that just happens to be there, which isn't all that likely, or, well, now, okay, you can try to play a Sufi mystic or something,
I think we have another question
We
here.
have a question, yes.
It was a bit ago.
Jacket 71.
He asked if you are planning more Sword and Caravan products after these ones. Well, the one you mentioned now.
Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road, it'll kind of depend on Mad Scribe, the publisher, if they keep wanting me to do more material. But I know that there are some people that have wanted an adventure, so I might, if Chris is willing to publish more, I might do some kind of an adventure, 1 or 2 adventures. It's set in the Silk Road, and I guess those would probably be likely to be popular. So yeah, I'm certainly open to doing it, and I have a few ideas of things that could be done.
And after that, what you mentioned other thing that you were
that was
preparing.
before we went live.
Yeah, before we went live. You mentioned another plan.
Well, my next product that I'm already working on, it's not anywhere near finished yet, and I haven't locked down a publisher for it yet, is probably going to be called Baptism of Fire. Some fans of mine probably already know this because it's not the first place I've mentioned it, but it's going to be another Lion and Dragon campaign book. This time it's going to be set. I'm kind of going backwards through time because the first Lion and Dragon campaign setting was Dark Albion, which was set in the 1450s, and then Sword and Caravan is set in the 1190s, and this next one is going to be set in like 1025, and it's Baptism of Fire is going to be set in the earliest period of the Kingdom of Poland, when the first Polish king Mieszko converts to Catholicism, and then he begins to spread Christianity. It's the Christianization of Poland, and it wasn't easy, right? In Poland, unlike certain other places, there was enormous pagan opposition from the pagan Slavic tribes, because also not all of them were even all that, you know, like they had basically been barbarian tribes, you know, one generation ago. And so they had been kind of united under this one tribe, the Poles, that everybody from anywhere in Poland is a Pole, right? That's what you just say they are. But they were actually just one tribe of hundreds of tribes that existed in Poland. And so there was a lot of political and religious opposition. And I'm going to play it specifically, I'm going to play it up in the focus on Slavic magic, Slavic monsters, and folklore, which is, you know, quite different than Western European folklore and magic and monsters. And so it's going to be basically the default setting will be player characters being heroic Christian adventurers in the service of the church or the crown that are fighting these pagan forces of kind of darkness or pagan monsters or you know, dark magics to try to spread the light of salvation to the Polish kingdom. So it'll be ironically a bit more Deus Vult in some ways than my Crusader campaign, you know, which is much more multicultural.
It's sounding highly problematic for me.
Yeah, well,
are we assuming the pagans are the evil people?
No, I won't go that far, but I will say that you know, there were some pagan tribes that were really, just like anywhere in Europe pre-Christianization, there were some pagan tribes that were absolute assholes, right? I mean, and then there were others that weren't, but that, you know, fundamentally, the reason Christianity succeeded in its spread through Europe was because it was generally a better deal for everybody involved, right? Like it represented, in a way, people tend to think of the church now as something ultra repressive, but in the 3rd to 10th centuries, it was this incredibly innovative, progressive idea of this like universal salvation of all human beings, right? Like, and most of the pagan cultures had this thing where, like, unless you were a king or a hero, your life wasn't worth shit, you know, and you were of no importance to the gods either, really, you know. So like, yeah, and which isn't to say that there weren't opportunities to live comfortably and what have you, but there was a lot of like fundamental injustices that the combination of kind of the remainder of Roman civilization and the Christian values that spread through Europe through Christianization, in a lot of places, Christianity was adopted very, very willingly by people who immediately saw why it was a better system, so to say. You know, there were, of course, places that had resistance, and Poland was one of them, to the point that certain parts of Poland, like what is today Prussia and Pomerania, were stayed resistant until like the 13th century. You know, they were the last pagans in all of Europe.
That's interesting because they're probably one of the most Catholic countries in Europe now.
Now, yeah, well, but that took both the Poles and then later the Teutonic Knights beating the living crap out of them and basically bringing them into submission. Yeah.
I presume that there aren't many role-playing games or like role-playing material based on Polish history. I can't remember anything.
I can't think of any. There might be some in Poland, because I know there are gamers in Poland, but I can't think of any that are in English, you know. And it's a region that'll, again, it'll have for a lot of Americans anyways, maybe Europeans are different, I don't know, you'll have to tell me, but you know how much you know about Poland, but for like a lot of Americans, even Polish Americans, don't know a lot about Poland historically or even geographically, right? So it'll also have this kind of fantasy element, and of course it's going to be set at such an early period in the very beginning of the 11th century. One of the first things I did when I started researching this book was looking at kind of demographics of that area of the world at that time, and the population rate, like how many people you had in a square kilometer, was just so absolutely tiny there. And what became very evident very quickly is that in that part, like Eastern Europe in the 11th century, what it had was cities that had population centers. So like, you know, and a city that had 2,000 people was a big city, you know, 2,000 people was large in Eastern Europe. And then it had like another 1,000 villagers or whatever living in little farms or villages or hamlets around, immediately like less than a day away from that city. And then you had huge sections of absolute wilderness until you got to the next city. So it's a very different kind of environment, and one that's actually quite good for adventuring, right? Because you're going to a city, you get to the city and you do things that are city things, but then after that, you're doing overland exploring, and there's no civilization for you to just double back to, you know, like it's all wilderland.
So you have a Polish ancestry, right?
I do.
But you don't speak Polish, or do you?
No, I don't. So I'm half Polish and half Latino, and you know, I was fortunate enough that that I had the opportunity to learn a little Spanish when I was young, and I improved it over time. But Polish is a much harder language to pick up in a place, well, basically anywhere in North America. You know, like it's not as common a language, right? So
yeah.
I know a little Polish, but I'm not fluent in it at all.
I work with a lot of Polish people because I work in a multinational, and they have a lot of part of the team is in Polish, and I can't even say their names most of the times. It's hard.
Though Portuguese sounds a little bit like Polish or Russian when you don't know the language.
Yeah,
it's very monotonous. Like,
well, see, Portuguese is so close to Spanish that for me, it just sounds like a variant.
Yeah. You probably understand it.
Well, yeah, more or less.
Better than the native Spanish speaker.
Let me put it this way: I can put on a Bolsonaro speech, and I don't need to look at the subtitles. Right?
It's probably easier to understand the Brazilians. They are more musical speaking.
Yeah, I haven't listened to too much Portuguese per se, as opposed to Brazilian Portuguese.
Do you find some of for example, the Spanish from Madrid? I think it's very hard to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I started learning Spanish, I found that Iberian Spanish in general, right, like Spanish spoken in Spain as opposed to Latin America, was quite difficult for me to grasp, right? Because usually what they teach in Canada, anyway, or at least the way where I learned it, is this kind of generic but Latin American Spanish, right? It's not Mexican specifically, or Peruvian or Argentinian or Uruguayan, obviously not, but it's from that sort of style. Whereas then, you know, the Spanish of Madrid, even the way they pronounce things is quite different, and then a lot of the actual words they use is quite different. Even their conjugation, right? The vosotros thing is used much more in Spain than it is, at least in Rio Platense Spanish, right, where I'm living. So yeah, that was hard initially, but I've kind of gotten better at it over time. And one of the things that's kind of helped is TV, because you know, Netflix has got some good, pretty good Spanish series out there that I've watched, and that's helped me pick up a bit more of being able to like capture in the ear the Madrid accent.
For us, for example, it's difficult. For example, if you are watching a Mexican movie, I don't need subtitles.
Yeah.
But if it's a Spanish movie, for example, a Pedro Almodovar movie, sometimes or most of the times we need subtitles. Not all the time, but sometimes
they can be subtitles in Spanish.
Yeah, even that, but
right.
it's easier, but you can't understand what they are saying. Maybe by reading you can understand it, but the accent is strange.
Hell, I wouldn't be able, I think, to follow a normal conversation in Italian spoken, right? But if you show me the subtitles in Italian, I'll immediately know what it is, because the linguistic similarities to Spanish are so close, right? As for Mexicans, though, like if it's a Mexican TV show or movie that is set in something to do with like upper class Mexicans, yes, I understand that quite clearly, right? But as soon as it's something else, like, you know, if it's a movie about narcos or something, and it's and they're talking with the, like, nobody uses more slang than Mexicans in Spanish. They've just got slang words for everything, and they're never the same as what any other region of the Spanish-speaking world uses, right? So you're like, what the hell are they saying?
Okay, so we have
because of their vocabulary, not really the accent or something.
Yeah. We have the same with the, well, though in Portugal we have a lot of exposition to Brazilian or Portuguese from Brazil, but still some of the words they use and some of the slang, I don't understand it. I just understand for the context.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm talking with my Brazilian colleagues and they just come out with something, what the hell did you just said? I never heard it in my life.
I have a question for you. Is there, in Portugal, is there more native Portuguese media, like, you know, TV shows and movies, or are you exposed or kind of overwhelmed, let's say, by either, say, Brazilian or Spanish media?
American media, basically. Well, the Portuguese media is very little. I think in the past there used to be more Spanish TV shows, then it became less, and a lot of Brazilians.
And
but
Brazilian
now we also
less
have, yes, but now I think we have more Spanish because of Netflix.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But we also have a lot of French media still.
Oh, yeah. Because I've always been curious about the social effects of that. Like here in Uruguay, obviously it's a very small country and it has almost no, like it has, you know, some talk shows and things like that. It's got a couple of TV channels, but it doesn't have any, you know, it doesn't have any Netflix series or anything like that for sure. And it doesn't even have like its own telenovelas or stuff like that, right? Its own soap operas. And so they get just completely bombarded by Argentinian media, which is notably kind of horrible in how it ends up influencing especially younger people in the way that they act and talk, because they start behaving more like Argentinians, and who the hell wants that, right?
Well, we do have because of YouTube, and we have a lot of when I was a kid, so all cartoons, most of the cartoons were in English. They weren't subbed. Now, well, they were in the normal TV, but if you go to cable, nothing was subbed. Now everything is subbed. Dubbed, yes, sorry. Now everything is dubbed, and it's really, really awful. But one of the things that I see and with my niece is YouTube, because kids go to YouTube and there's a lot of Brazilian content, and yes, then they start speaking with a Brazilian accent.
They start acting like Brazilians. Yeah,
exactly. My sister doesn't allow. She's like, no, you don't. But a lot of parents don't care.
Yeah, the American stuff is less dangerous for non-English speaking cultures, because even though everybody might end up acting a little more American because of just how much media comes from the United States, if you're not an English speaking culture, you're not going to end up being as ingrained by that as if it's from a culture that's very close to your own, but has some important differences, right? That's where you get into like real trouble.
Okay, so you have some questions here. Let me check. There was something from Judd Goswick.
And there's something about the Invisible College.
Oh yeah, do we have any diaries of caravanserai of the time? Who were some famous merchants?
Well, look, there's basically, in this period that Sword and Caravan is set, we know that this was a moment when trade first exploded from the Silk Road into Europe, because you mark a point a few years after the end of the Third Crusade, where it's the first time several major products arrive in Europe. There are already some things coming in before that because of Muslim traders through Damascus that went to the Crusader states, and so like silk and even Damascus steel was already known about, right, at the time. But after the Third Crusade, it's suddenly there where you have large amounts of things like spices and sugar coming into Europe from what is clearly further down the Silk Road. So we know that there was trade, very active trade, that was going on for those 30 years from like 1190 to 1220. But we have very little record of who was doing it. It wasn't really heavily detailed. The earliest stuff that we get is after, because once Genghis Khan destroys the Silk Road, he like conquers it, but he conquers it by like wiping out most of the major cities there. There's a period of about 20 years where the Silk Road is just cut off to everyone, and all that trade dies out for about a generation. And it's only around the 1250s that trade starts picking up again, the 1240s and 1250s. And only there do you have some of the earliest records of Western people going there. And most of those are quite scant. So there was some merchants, mainly, you know, like from areas of what is today Italy, that ended up traveling. And of course, a few decades after that, you have Marco Polo, right, who is the most famous, and a lot of people say he was like the first one, but he really wasn't. His dad, for starters, crossed the entire Silk Road and got to China, and then came back before Marco Polo did. Marco Polo went with him on his second voyage, and his dad wasn't the first one either. That's very clear, right? So there was already, by the time that Marco Polo's dad was doing it, it was already something that was being commonly done. But it wasn't something that was getting a lot of record, right? Because most of these people were not, you know, these are not historical records that were common at the time to make. So you have a couple of details of certain monks that travel along the Silk Road for one purpose or another, usually either to make contact with Christian communities along the Silk Road, or to try to preach to the Khan, you know, to preach to the Kublai Khan or to one of the various Mongol warlords to try to convert them. And of course, a lot of them, there are probably a lot of them that went, and a lot of them just never came back. But a few of them went and came back, and you have the details of their stories. So there were several friars, like Franciscans especially, because they were following the example of Francis of Assisi, who in the Fifth Crusade, he went and tried to convert the Sultan of Damascus to Christianity, during the Crusade. So Franciscans, but also some Dominicans and some others that traveled along the Silk Road. And then we know there were merchants, but there are only a couple of very scant kind of records of merchants before Marco Polo. And then Marco Polo kind of figured out that, you know, he can make a story out of this, and it was very, very famous, you know. So there isn't a lot of specific details about how the about who were, like, there were no famous merchants at that time that traveled the Silk Road, but we know that there were European merchants that traveled from 1192 onwards along the Silk Road.
Jack71 asked another question. If there's going to be something more for Invisible College after the gun book, and now I ask a question. I didn't know there was going to be a gun book.
Yes, there is, but I'm not the person writing that book.
Oh, okay.
A fan of the Invisible
I was finding
College.
it surprising that you would write a gun book.
Yes, exactly. It's not my area of specialty. In the Invisible College, you know, I have very detailed stuff about the occult, about occult history, and also a lot of detailed stuff about like historical secret societies and about intelligence services, right? Spies and things like that. But I don't have a very detailed section on firearms. You know, I have very basic rules on guns and armor that I cooked up, and you know, I didn't put a big emphasis on that. And of course, there were some people that really want to play, especially I guess if you want to play like the kind of secret agent aspect of the Invisible College book. There are some people that are big gun nuts. I'm just not one of them. You know, I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment, but I'm not a gun nut myself, and I've never owned a gun. So one of them got in touch with me and said, look, I'd really like to do a book where I put, you know, I create more accurate and detailed firearms and weapons and armor for the Invisible College. And I said, well, that's fine with me. You know, all of my books are like, they have an open license. So if someone wants to make a source book for them, they can, and they can, you know, obviously if they want to use the material, then that's up to the publisher. And if they want to get my endorsement, well, they should pass it through me first. But so this guy said, yeah, okay, so I'm going to do it. And I said, well, and are you going to publish it? He goes, well, I would like to. And I say, well, you know, let me check with my publisher to see if he might be interested in publishing it, because obviously having an official source book of any kind of helps a product, right? Mm-hmm. So I contacted Well of Word Press, and they were interested. I don't know much more about it because, you know, I just presented the writer to the publisher, and I'm not going to make any money off it or anything like that, but I'm happy that it's happening, right? As far as other books, right now, I don't have a plan to do any other Invisible College products. It was a pretty complete game. It's like, you know, 430 some pages. And I'm not saying it won't ever happen. I might write some adventures, or I might present some other kind of occult groups or things like that. But my priority for the last while was on Sword and Caravan. And then I've got, you know, I have other books that I still want to come along and produce after this, you know, after Sword and Caravan, starting with Baptism of Fire. I might also do some other science fiction products again later on. So I don't know if I'm going to get back to Invisible College or not. I guess it'll depend.
Invisible College is a very complete book. It has lots of information.
Yeah, everything you need to run the game in there, except sophisticated gun rules, if that's what you want. So
and perhaps, well, scenarios you could always have. Probably it would sell anyway.
Yeah. I mean, there are like 50 adventure seeds in the appendix to the Invisible College, but there isn't like a fully fleshed out adventure per se. So yeah, there could be adventures for it. Yeah.
Well, I think I would like to try to mash up Red Epoch and Invisible College, but I'll tell you about it next year probably.
I think that would be really interesting. I think everything you guys have been doing has been really fascinating because, you know, like I said, the first time I was on here, I had no idea who you guys were even. You know, I checked, you contacted me on Twitter. I took a look at your channel. You had like, I don't know, 3 views on your videos and things like that. And I said, oh, what the hell? You know, I was like, you know, at first I kind of mistakenly thought you might be Spanish because I'd been, you know, interviewed before by people in the Spanish OSR in Spanish and everything, right? On YouTube channels. But so I'm always happy to do that sort of thing. And so I said yes, and I said, oh, wait a minute, they're Portuguese, but that's okay too, right? As long as we do the interview in English. And as I came on here, but I had very little experience of you. And now, you know, about a year later, less than a year later, you guys have made like what, 12 books or something like that. It's just crazy.
Yeah, a bit
amazing.
more.
We are like a fungus.
Like, that is, you know, like I thought I was impressive with RPGPundit Presents, where for like 2 years straight I came out with almost 1 product a week. But you guys are coming out with relatively thick OSR books at an incredible rate and being very popular at it, right? Like the whole wretched verse, as you call it, which I've deemed the spaghetti punk genre is
I like that one.
Quite remarkable. You know, it's been very popular, and I've gotten your books now for review. They're in my queue. I have so many people who send me books to review that I've got this giant pile of books I've got to slowly catch up on, because I only do a book review once every couple of weeks, maybe, right? So, but it is coming. I'm going to start, because anytime one publisher sends me multiple books, I'll stagger them, right? Like I'll mix them with other multiple books that people have sent, so I don't just do like 5 reviews for the same company at a time, you know. So some of them are going to come up pretty soon, and I have already kind of glanced a little at your products, and I look at them and I go, yeah, this is interesting. I haven't looked at them in depth to like see the full element of their strengths or weaknesses, but at first glance I look at it and I go, oh yeah, this seems really cool. You know?
I'm curious to know your opinion, of course. Since you were mentioning Spanish interviews, I think the Spanish had I don't know if they still have an industry, or well, not really an industry, a community, a role-playing community. That's many games. I don't know if they still are producing games or not.
Well, I think they are, and I mean, like, there are some. You know, I mean, it's been a few years now since Marca del Este came out, you know, the Eastern Marches. But that one was like a huge hit. And, you know, they've had so many really successful, they've got some very creative game designers there. And, you know, like Aquelarre was a direct influence on Lion and Dragon. You know, it was before Lion and Dragon, the most medieval authentic role-playing game ever made was Aquelarre, which is a Spanish role-playing game set in Spain in the turn of the 13th century. Very good game. And but there were lots of other ones that they've made, both like sort of OSR type games and other styles of games. You know, they do tend to be kind of to some degree kind of rip-off artists, right? Because they kind of came up with OSR type ideas before there was an OSR, because Aquelarre is a great game, but it's very clearly a mod of the Chaosium rule set. You know, it's been adjusted to fit what they want it to be, which is exactly what we do now with the OSR. So I'm not crapping on that. You know, I'm not saying that's bad. It's actually quite clever, but nobody used to do that. And these guys did it, and Aquelarre came out like in the very early 90s, I think. So they've been doing it for a long time. And for example, the Capitana La Triste RPG, which is probably one of the best swashbuckling RPGs I've ever seen, was also, it was very clearly a super simplified version of GURPS, just specifically done for the Aquelarre genre. For the Capitana La Triste genre. Of that type of swashbuckling during the period of the what was it, the the campaign in the Netherlands, you know.
Yeah. Flanders.
And, it was great, but they did like to make these products that are derived from successful systems, and that was like a decade and a half before the OSR existed.
Yeah, electricity is what, 20 years, maybe 20 years old. I'm very sad I never bought it.
Yeah. we have it printed, but well, anyway.
Yeah, there was a pirate PDF and I had it printed, but of course that's not the same thing. I couldn't even find it on eBay. I tried to find it on eBay.
I have the first edition of Aquelarre.
I still don't have Aquelarre as well, but that one, well, that one is on print yet, and
That one's done
it will
several
be.
editions, and so like the newer editions are much bigger than the original. Like I've got it's a thin book, the first edition, but it's also probably like really classic, you know. So I'm glad.
Yeah, this one is a big book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Electricity is special because we are big fans of Captain Electricity.
Yeah, well, that's an incredible series of novels. Yeah, really genius.
I'm checking the comments to see if there's some more questions here. I'm not sure that there's lots of comments.
People are chatting, but I don't think we have.
Okay, they're talking about Tønsberg and whatever. Okay.
Tønsberg. I just heard today that the Tønsberg, they're going to come out with a $30 version of Tønsberg. Because one thing about the hardcover of Tønsberg, it's beautiful, it's amazing, but it's probably kind of expensive. I never know what anything costs because I just get sent everything for free. But I'm guessing it's really expensive. So
$100, right?
Yeah, $100. I bought it,
and that's expensive.
Yeah, I just hope customs don't mess with me. Yeah, but I want the hardcover because I want the pretty book.
They've just announced though that they're going to do a soft cover version for $30. So that means
that's
everybody can have Tønsberg. I always think that's a good idea. I always try to make, you know, people like the deluxe version of stuff, right? Like they demanded to have a premium color version of Sword and Caravan, right? So that one's like $49.99. But I will always insist with my publishers that you have to have, you know, the soft cover version too, and the regular color, and that one's like $29.99, right? And I've done that.
Especially if you're gonna play it, because you're going to use it, because you're not gonna ruin the pretty book.
Yeah. The soft cover is much more usable, right? So like, for example, the soft cover black and white of Lion and Dragon is only $15.81, right? It's $15.81. You know, it's like
I think that's the one. That's the one we have, right? I don't know. No, we have the art cover.
No, you have an hardback, yeah.
The hardcover is only $23, so it's an incredible value as far as the price of RPG books is concerned, right? And the amazing thing, I was just commenting on this on Twitter the other day, because for once, Dom Publishing sent me my royalties exactly on time. He's always a little bit late because he's French, but he sent me this time. He sent them to me right on time, and I was just kind of surprised in thinking that I only made 3 books for Dom Publishing for Lion and Dragon, Dark Albion, and Cults of Chaos. The last of those was published 6 years ago, and it's still getting 4-figure profits pretty much every month. You know, so like it's that's been an incredibly successful series. And I think part of it is because it's affordable. You know, I don't believe in putting prices too high up if it can be avoided. But I mean, if people want the deluxe version, that's going to be more expensive, obviously.
I always like hardbacks for core books. It's but for the rest, I don't really care. There's a problem with drive-through. I think the printing quality is never good, even when it's premium color. I don't see much of a difference between premium and the regular one.
Well, I heard that criticism of the Invisible College, that it was really hard to see any difference between the standard and the premium color. And I mean, it might depend, right? Different people have different levels of how much they can tell subtleties of color,
Yeah.
you know. Definitely not colorblind, right? But from what I saw between the you know, because we did have at one point a premium color Invisible College book, and then we took it out because we looked at that and we said, neither the publisher nor myself could see any difference in the quality of the color. So why have it, right?
Yeah, that's
but I guess some people can. And, you know, they say that there is a wide spectrum of that, and that, for example, women can tell, like, as a rule, far more variation and differences in qualities of color than men can, you know, which is how, you know, women have like 15 different words for green. You know?
Yeah.
For us, it's called green. If you're a man, green is just green, but for a woman, it's like, it's all kinds of things.
I think it's fashion that puts that ideas in our heads, so we can buy more stuff.
But it's evolutionary though, right? Like there was probably certain reasons why women had to be able to distinguish color more effectively than men. You know, it's probably some caveman thing. You know, like, because it's a known scientific fact, right? It's not just social. It's biological.
Okay, let me check the chat because I have Carl.
Redshift asked if you ever done a video on your collection. I think he means
It's
books.
our collection, or a Griffith. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
On your
Sorry?
collection. But yeah.
Perhaps he's talking about books. I don't know. Some people do that.
I never shared videos of all of my RPG books. Well, look, I've got.
Yeah, probably your collection.
Yeah, I think it's that's what he means.
2, 3, 4, like 5 bookshelves of RPG books, you know, and so I have I live in technically it's a 3-bedroom house, right? But I obviously, one of those bedrooms is being used as a kind of a library room, and so, but that's where I keep the books that I don't frequently refer to. And so all the RPG books that I almost never use are in those shelves. And then I have in my actual living room, which is where I game, I have 3 bookshelves of RPG products, one of which is just overflow from the library because my library is full. But then the other 2, one of them is like books that I very occasionally use, which is next to where my players sit. And then the one right next to where I sit when I DM is the bookshelf that has the books that I use very, very often. But no, I've never really videoed them all, but I've done, you know, almost every book that I've gotten in the last, what would it be? The last 17 years, I've either written a review for or done a video review about, right? So people could discern which books I have based on that. Like the ones that I haven't done that for are only really books that I had to buy before I became the RPG pundit, you know, and there was, you know, a lot of those, dozens of those too, of course. I had a really big collection of D&D books, Palladium, and quite a few others, miscellaneous ones, you know, Warhammer, what else? Well, the 3rd edition books, I had some D20 stuff. I've got D20 Cthulhu and D20 Star Wars. And, you know, a few GURPS books, but I wasn't so much a fan of GURPS as a system, but I liked their historical books that they came out with in the 90s. So I had a few of those. I have a few of those. They're all on the bookshelf somewhere, you know.
So you never got rid of your old books?
Sorry?
You never got rid of your old books?
No, I mean, I got rid of some of them when I moved here in 2003. So I had a much bigger collection of D&D stuff, for example, some of which I left behind, you know. So I've got a much smaller, I kept with me my 1st edition Player's Handbook and DMG, and I kept my my Mystara books, my basic D&D stuff, and my rule cyclopedia, which was always the system I liked the best out of the old TSR Dungeons and Dragons. But there was a lot of stuff that I kind of left behind when I moved. But that was the only time I did any kind of a book purge as such.
And Griffith is asking if you're going to eBay his purple the purple cover.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's not like I'm hurting for money, you know. So I just I want to sell it, you know. Like I've been somehow. Oh, we've got some kind of a spam bot on the chat here about a dating site.
Oh, good.
That's I've never seen that before. I've never seen that on one of my live streams. But no, I mean, like I've this month, for example, on the 1st of November. So that's to say, yesterday, I've already, you know, I get money coming in over the course of the month as different publishers or, you know, YouTube or whatever send me money. But just like November 1st, I've already made more money than I need this month. So I'm the only reason I would ever sell books would be if I was like on the absolute lowest ebb of poverty, right? I'm a big collector of books, and I don't believe in selling them. You know, if there's books that I know I'm never going to use, I might give them away to people, but I'm not big on selling books. You know,
I sold a lot of them. But
some of them
almost.
you bought again, and so
Yeah.
that was just stupid.
Yeah, it was kind of stupid.
With RPG books, sometimes think, well, I'm never going to use this stupid thing again.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I thought.
That happened with some of the D&D books that I left behind when I moved, right? I was like, well, I'm never going to use this, right? And then later on, I was like, oh shit, I should have kept that, you know, because I wanted to look up something on there, right? So I'd have to get the PDF or something, you know.
Judd is commenting, it would be funny if Pundit was a closet Rifts fanboy, still playing his city raid in Chintown.
Chi-Town.
Yeah,
Chi-Town.
someone was
Look,
asking, I think it was Coombs, what is your favorite Palladium game?
Judd, I am not a closet Rifts fanboy. I am a completely open Rifts fanboy. I think Rifts is an amazing setting. I think Palladium Books are an amazing company, and they made so many incredible RPGs over the years. For one thing, they had my personal mentor in gaming, Eric Wujik, worked for them for many years and made incredible products for them. And, you know, I was one of the first RPGs I played that wasn't Dungeons and Dragons was Robotech, because I was a big Robotech fan as a kid, right? And it was, you know, the longest campaign I ever ran up until this year was a campaign of Palladium rules. It started as a Robotech campaign. Eventually, it kind of transformed into a Rifts campaign, and I played it for like a decade, right? I ran it all through from junior high until university, you know, like it was that kind of a range. And it's only been surpassed this year by my Dungeon Crawl Classics World of the Last Sun campaign, which is finally tied with it, and is you know, as of February, I think it's going to beat it in terms of the longest campaign I've ever run. So I think that those products are amazing, and people who haven't actually, there's a lot of people that crap on Palladium that haven't actually read any of the Palladium books, and you know, there are some that don't like it because they think that they're kind of childish in a way, but that's a stupid argument, because there's a lot of great action and drama, you know, like they're not, you know, Vampire the Masquerade or some shit like that that's full of pretentiousness, right? But they have really sophisticated world building in a way that is a little bit gonzo, to be fair, but that is brilliant, you know, and that has so many different possibilities for play. And the system, some people don't like, but I think a lot of times it's because people have either not read it carefully enough or haven't realized how easy it is to modify, you know. So, you know, I've always been a big admirer of Palladium. The worst thing about them is just that they don't get their books out on time.
We never played Palladium, and that what you're saying, they have a bad reputation, or as a childish thing. That's what I have heard, and that's why I never try them. People here would usually avoid it. And well, I thought,
I suggest people take a look at them, because they're pretty incredible. I mean, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, for example, was one of the most important and innovative RPGs made in the 80s, you know, and of course it wasn't like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like the children's show that came later. It was based on the comic series, right, which was quite a bit more serious, so to say, it was much less childish than the children's cartoon, right? People think of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles today and think of it like it's as the kids show, but that's not what that game was. And it had like this incredible system for generating these mutant animal characters that nobody had ever thought up until that moment when Eric Wujcik designed that, But yeah, I mean, they make great products, and there's a reason why out of all of the companies that were around in the 80s, Palladium is one of the only one that survived. It's Palladium, Chaosium, and Steve Jackson Games, right? And Steve Jackson Games really only survived because of non-RPG products, right? Because of Illuminati and Munchkin. So Chaosium and Palladium are the only two RPG companies from the 80s that actually maintained success beyond the kind of apocalypse of the 90s when all these companies went under.
Griffith asks something about,
To
can we talk more about Lost Sun
yeah.
Setting? What is specifically? Is it from Gene Wolfe?
No, it isn't. World of the Last Sun is my own gonzo fantasy setting that was created for my Dungeon Crawl Classics campaign. And since then, I've published the book, World of the Last Sun, which is not a DCC book, but it's an OSR book that can be used with any OSR product, though it is really set up to run really well, obviously, with Dungeon Crawl Classics, because that's the campaign that's the system I ran it for, right? And what it is a setting of weird fantasy, gonzo fantasy. It's set in a world of my own creation that I made mainly because I looked at the DCC rules. I thought that they were quite amazing, but I thought also that there was the default setting that you see in the Dungeon Crawl Classics products, especially their earlier products, was still very kind of, it was regular fantasy with just a touch of weird. But you look at the actual rules of how things like clerics work and magic works, demon patrons and all that stuff. I thought, no, the default world for DCC has to be a hell of a lot weirder than just like Lankmar or something like that, So I tried to create a setting that fits how the rules work. So like that the rules really reflect what the physics of the setting would be, or vice versa. So for example, the easiest example to give is in Dungeon Crawl Classics, if you're a cleric, when you try to do a cleric spell, you roll a die to see if you succeed, right? And if you get a bad roll, you can get what's called disapproval, which means that God is angry with, that your God is angry with you, right? And this has nothing to do, it's not tied in any way to alignment, right? Or to what you're trying to do with the spell. Because it would be one thing if it's like, well, okay, if you're trying to cast a spell that goes against what the god's portfolio is or what the alignment is, then there's a chance that God will require some kind of a penitence from you for it. That would make perfect sense, for example, maybe in like Lion and Dragon, right? But in Dungeon Crawl Classics, it's entirely random. It's just you rolled bad, so now God is angry at you, right? And I said, well, what kind of world would that make sense in? It would make sense only in a world where God is crazy, right? So one of the first things I said, well, okay, so why would God be crazy? I said, okay, well, what if God is a computer and it's malfunctioning, right? So that was like really where the whole World of the Last Sun started, right? So I said, so what kind of a world would you have where God is a computer, right? And I said, okay, well, how about this? You've got a universe that is dying, and the suns, all the stars are dying out, and this super civilization creates a Dyson sphere around the last star in that universe and develops a technology that will let it jump out of that universe and travel through this void between universes until it can find another universe just so that they can survive. And they bring into that Dyson sphere, which is enormous, right, all kinds of alien species that they could collect. And they create this very structured and ordered environment that's governed by this computer. And that has, different races having different positions of hierarchy and roles within the sphere, while they the super race themselves are kind of like on some other level above it all, supervising, right? And then what happens is that at some point during the voyage, some kind of terrible disaster takes place, right? And the super race vanishes or is disconnected. Nobody knows what happens to them. And the computer has some kind of a terrible error and starts to malfunction. And the whole place goes up in chaos, right? And so everything, all of that stability and structure that was created by the ancients and governed by the computer has fallen apart. And so you have this kind of post-apocalyptic world, and the start of the, the setting of the campaign is, thousands of years after that has happened, right? So a lot has changed along the way, and there's been like ecological disasters. So there are more mutant races and a lot of weird stuff is happening. And you have, all of the order and structure that was there is mostly gone. There are still places in the world of the Last Sun where you have remnants of that. So there are various different levels of technology. There are parts of the world of the Last Sun that are basically primitive, like completely caveman level technology. And then you have places where you have super science and very high tech societies. So you have like these floating islands that orbit the sun that have some societies there that have what is basically space travel, but inside the inner space of the Dyson sphere. And so you can have everything in there, right? You can have talking animals, you can have weird mutants, you can have elves and dwarves and halflings. You can have parts of the world which are like bits of remnants from other planets. So you can have like sci-fi stuff in there. If you really wanted to, there could be, I don't know, Klingons in there. There aren't in my version of it, but there could be, right? Because it's also enormous, because it's like an enormous landmass that would have to occupy this Dyson sphere, right? And so you have all of these sort of aspects. And then I went along thinking of the races of the setting. And so obviously I'm going to use the default races of DCC, which are elves, dwarves, halflings, and humans, right? But I decided it would be very interesting if in the world of the Last Sun, you had like the elves were the kind of middle managers for the ancients. They were the guys that were meant to keep order and stuff. But after the disaster, like the best of the elves were all wiped out by it. And so what you have now is these kind of degenerate versions of the previous elves. So you have, instead of like these great super scientists and ultra wizards and incredible warrior knights, now you have like hipster elves, and you have these science elves that putter around in these domes, and you have these kind of elves that have gone back to being like kind of Victorian Englishmen or something, so weird stuff like that, right? And then like the dwarves obviously are the guys that live under the earth, but under the earth in the context of the Dyson sphere means that they were like managing these super machines that maintained all of the biosphere of the inner world. And they were forced out by these terrible creatures from the void, which were the cause of the crisis. So now the dwarves are basically living in a diaspora on the surface, always hoping to recover their lost homeland, but they're basically a people without a home, and they're full of resentment and grumpiness because of that, right? And then the halflings, I said, well, fuck it. The halflings are just these feral monstrosities that are, cannibals and incredibly vicious, and they're like one step away from being goblins or something, and humans are an endangered species. They were once, the most populous people in the world of the Last Sun, but they were especially vulnerable to all the radiation and stuff that happened. So there's tons of near humans, what are, basically mutants of all different kinds, but pure humans are very rare. And that's important because only humans are able to become clerics and connect to God, to the computer that is called God. So there's very few clerics in the world too, right? And so I went along building all this world building stuff. And then I started playing, and I ran this campaign for years before I published World of the Last Sun. So the book that is published is like probably from, I think it was like 5 or 6 years into the campaign, right? I'm trying to remember, when was it published? It's published in, it was added in 2020. So it was actually a lot more than that, 7 or 8 years. I guess the writing of it was done about 6 or 7 years into the campaign, right? So there's six or 7 years of actual lore of these different regions of the Last Sun. And there's rules there about there's the different fantasy races, high-tech equipment, encounter tables, various different regions of the Last Sun are covered, which are all, they're all kind of weird. And there's like a very, very strong element of gonzo humor there, which is like a weird mixture of fantasy and sci-fi, plus some like humoristic elements to it, right? Like it's this kind of Hunter S. Thompson style. A lot of the influence for World of the Last Sun in terms of let's say fictional sources is stuff like the writings of Hunter S. Thompson, the Adventure Time cartoon, the Venture Brothers, Rick and Morty, but also stuff like Transmetropolitan, right? The comic book series, right? And stuff like that. So it's got this kind of weird mix of like this cynical social commentary without being very political. And where I am political, I tend to be a very equal opportunist critic of things in the book. So like one of the themes of the world is failure, right? And that means that almost everybody is kind of a screw up in some way. All the major civilizations have flaws, right? And all the major organizations, the good ones and the bad ones, are imperfect in different ways, you know. So it's a game that you can play the humor up, or you can dial it down if you want to, you know. But it's a very interesting. It's like, you know, it's got elements from it of, in terms of role playing, of Rifts, of Gamma World, even a Paranoia. What else? Well, Dark Sun, you know, it has some other, you know, shout outs to different OSR stuff. So like Fuck Station Aleph in World of the Last Sun, which is in the book, in the setting book, you've got a whole chapter on Fuck Station Aleph, is my satirical send up of Venture Satanis's Alpha Blue, right? And the Wizard City of Lol is a send up of Joe Bittman's DCC adventure of the, what is it, the 999th Council of Wizards. And it has like these pseudo Daleks in it, right? And what other one was it? Oh yeah, and the Shithole is in some ways my send up of these like ultra lethal settings, like the D&D Dark Sun setting, or Carcosa, which I hated as a product, you know. And it's me saying both, in all three of those cases, it's me both saying I'm going to make fun of the original, and I'm going to show how it can be done better at the same time, you know.
Griffith is asking, would Pundit ever write a novella set in the world setting?
Oh, absolutely not. And, I mean, I'm very much on record for saying that I'm not a fan of the novel as a literary genre. You know, I think it's very, you know, it was an interesting experiment for the last couple of centuries, but it's largely inferior to anything else. If I was ever going to write anything for anything, it would be like a myth or a legend or a chronicle, but never a novel.
Going backwards a bit, your planned game about Polish history. I was wondering, you are going to mention Polish myths and mythological creatures and fables.
Oh, no. It's going to be a huge bestiary of these tremendously weird creatures from Polish and Slavic folklore, you know, that are very different from, you know, the kind of the Western monsters. Now, for example, I know that in Iberia, right, in Spain and Portugal, there's a lot of really unusual monsters also that are kind of distinct from kind of the standard Western European monsters. Especially, you know, in Basque country, you have these really weird Basque monsters, and I always thought that the Basques had the weirdest monsters until I really started researching the old Slavic and Polish myths, and then I realized that there's some stuff in there that just like absolutely makes the Basque stuff look, well, maybe not normal, but it certainly makes them look a lot less weird by comparison, you know.
Well, I would say that my knowledge, well, of Polish folklore would be, well, very little, but I would say that I don't know if the Witcher, the books, not the TV show, is. I think it's pretty accurate, right? Because the author.
Now, here's the thing. I've never really read the Witcher novels, nor have I watched the TV series, nor have I played the game. Right? I've watched a couple of episodes of the TV series, didn't like it, stopped watching it. But
TV show is awful.
I've been told that the monsters in the novels are based on real monsters from Polish folklore or Slavic folklore, right? And it's really funny how all of these products that I make end up being stuff that other people tell me, hey, this could be run for this thing, right? The only exception being with Lion and Dragon, I've had a lot of people say, well, you can use like Dark Albion and Lion and Dragon to run a Game of Thrones campaign. And I said, yeah, of course, right? And I have watched, I never read the books, but I watched Game of Thrones, the series. And of course, Game of Thrones is based on the War of the Roses. So you could, using Dark Albion with the Lion and Dragon rules, you could make a hell of a Game of Thrones campaign, right? But then, like after that, what was it? When I published Star Adventure, no, not Star Adventure, sorry, the Invisible College, for example, I had people saying, well, you know, you could probably run the Magicians with this game. I said, well, maybe, I don't know. I never watched the Magicians, right? And then with Sword and Caravan, people were saying, well, was it Assassin's Creed? You know, you could run Assassin's Creed with this. And I'm like, well, I've never played Assassin's Creed, but I'm sure that that's true, right? And with Baptism of Fire, when I've talked about it, I already heard people saying, well, you could run The Witcher with this. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. You know? So another thing I'm going to do after Baptism of Fire, which just to get ahead of the curve, my next product, well, maybe not my next one, I don't know, but one of them after that is going to be another Lion and Dragon campaign setting, which is going to be set in the Anarchy, which was the civil war that happened in England between Stephen and Matilda, which was because of a succession crisis, because, you know, the king died and he had no male heir. And the Anarchy is very clearly the inspiration for House of the Dragon, which is the new Game of Thrones series, right? And I'd already been planning to do the Anarchy like years ago, right? I knew that one of the only other historical English setting I really wanted to do for Lion and Dragon was going to be the Anarchy, because it's a very exciting period as far as I'm concerned, right? And now House of the Dragon comes out and I'm like, oh shit, you know, they're going to say I did it because of that, right? But really I was going to do it all along. But I'm very happy that when I do come out with it, everybody's going to say, wow, you can use this to run House of the Dragon, you know?
Well, what about science fiction? You haven't done much of it, except Star Adventure, I think.
Star Adventure is, I mean, technically, you know, War of the Last Sun is science fantasy, I guess you could say, because there's a lot of like sci-fi stuff in it. There's like basically spaceships and power armor and lightsabers and, you know, whatever else, guns and everything. But no, I mean, I've done Star Adventure, and there are a couple of other things I might end up doing that are like sci-fi. One thing that I would really like to do at some point would be a cyberpunk setting. But the problem that I have with that is that you know, I wouldn't want to do a 1980s cyberpunk game. Right? I think there's a lot of those already, and some of them are good and whatever. But I mean, to me, it's that doing that would be kind of pointless. But what I would like to do possibly is a modern cyberpunk. That is to say, a cyberpunk that, just in the same way as the 1980s cyberpunk was a projection of things that were happening in the 80s into the future. Something that would be a projection of things that are happening now onto the future. But the problem with that is that there's no way I could do that without it being extremely political, right? And I make a point in my games not being especially political, right? I'm a right-wing guy, but my books aren't right-wing books, right? They like Sword and Caravan doesn't make any commentary on modern politics, right? And even The Invisible College doesn't. The Invisible College is maybe the most political book I've ever written, but it's like the politics of the 18th century. You know, it's like, I'm basically saying, well, you know, Western liberal values are the best values. And if that's extremely controversial, we're all in a lot of trouble, you know, but I guess that's as close as I've gotten to a political statement in any RPG I've written. But if I did a cyberpunk game, I mean, basically the World Economic Forum would have to be the bad guys, right? And there'd be all this stuff about like what would be the cyberpunk dystopia of projected from 2022, right? It would be about, you know, the Great Reset, the metaverse being a key for social control, social credit, you know, the corporate state alliance being used to suppress people, the use of drones and AI and algorithms to control people, you know, all that stuff. It would totally look like I was writing a political game.
Yeah.
You know? So
It's a depressive dystopia.
Yeah,
much worse than the other one. I prefer the cyberpunk of the 80s had a dystopia that was more stylish.
Yeah, well, I mean, and when you think about it, right, it's like the 80s dystopia is like, oh, the Japanese are going to own us all, you know? Fuck, that could be worse, right? Like,
yeah.
Now the dystopia is like, you know, we're going to all have to live in pods and eat bugs, you know?
Yeah.
It's much worse. You know, we're all going to be basically living in. I commented about this in my 6,000 subscriber live stream this weekend, where I was talking about like the horror of the modern world is that instead, you know, when China became part of the world financial system, the theory was that by entering into the world financial system, China would eventually become more like us. But what actually happened is that all of these technocrats, starting with the fuckers in the European Union, saw how China controlled its population and said, why can't we do that? Like, wouldn't it be wonderful if unelected bureaucrats in the managerial class and scientists and sociologists could just force everyone to do stuff and we didn't have to worry about like pesky democracy getting in the way, right? So over the last 30 years since China became part of the world markets, China hasn't become more like us. The West has become more like China, and it's become more and more accelerated over time, right? So now there were a ton of people during the COVID pandemic that were looking at what China was doing, saying, well, we have to be like that, you know, like we have to have social credit scores and complete control over our population, you know. It's pretty freaking terrifying, right? So I'm not sure if I'm ever going to actually publish an OSR cyberpunk book. But I do have some other ideas. You know, I've got in mind to do like some kind of a space opera campaign that would kind of be, it would be a bit like a science fiction version of a medieval saga, you know, like it's something like that, you know. So Knights in Space or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I actually have an idea for an adventure for Wretched Space. I think I'm going to do an adaptation of De Lusíadas. That's a Portuguese, how do you call it?
Epic,
exactly. Epic poem about the discoveries. And so I think I'm going to try to
call them discoveries. That's problematic.
I'm going to try to turn that into a space adventure.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yeah. It's good to go with these sources also that you know other people might not immediately recognize.
Exactly, nobody knows.
Well,
yeah,
it's the same
one.
thing as like Sword and Caravan, right? Or Baptism of Fire, is that, you know, because I'm looking at a culture that is not the culture I'm writing for. To a lot of people, this will seem fantastical, right? Even though but it has all the advantages of writing from history. And that's a big advantage because no fantasy world invented in someone's head is going to be as realistic as history. Okay? And so if you write a fantasy version of history, it's part of the success of Game of Thrones, right? If you're writing a fantasy version of history, that's going to be instantly, it's going to have qualities that a world just made up by one guy from his own head is not going to have. And it has universal appeal, right? It has the appeal of time and of you know, if you're using like literary sources, right? If you're doing if your inspiration is Beowulf, you know, or you know, the Mahabharata, you know, like Arrows of Indra is, you know, like that's stuff that has stood the test of time, you know.
There's another thing that real stories can be used, and sometimes they are more interesting than fictional ones. I've been ripping off real stories a lot of time.
If you look at the history of you know, of any of these things, like there are things that happen in the War of the Roses, right? Or in the history of the Silk Road, right? Stuff that just, you couldn't make that shit up, right? The Fifth Crusade, right? The Fifth Crusade is just unbelievable because you have this force of 20,000 crusaders get to the Holy Land, right? And they start marching at like the perfect time when there's like a certain level of like the Muslims under Saladin, who was Saladin's brother, who was the ruler at that time. They were kind of taken by surprise, you know, and they weren't expecting it. And they march initially towards Egypt, thinking to cut in half the Muslim Empire, because at that time the Muslim Empire, the Ayyubids were Egypt and Syria connected, right? And so if they could cut that in half, they would suddenly create huge problems for the Muslim forces. And in their way, there's this incredible fortress called Damietta, and they take that fortress, and Saladin is so stunned by this that he drops dead, right? So that they just killed the guy that was their main opponent, right? And his son, Al-Kamil, he's unprepared, right? And there's some people, you know, there's a succession crisis, and like everything was in their favor, right? And then all of a sudden, the Pope sends this cardinal over, this guy named Pelagius, right? And Pelagius shows up, and he is now the papal legate, which means he's the boss, right? And Al-Kamil comes along, and he says, look, we want to make peace, right? Guess what? We'll give you back Jerusalem. We'll give you back the territories around Jerusalem. We'll rebuild the walls of Jerusalem for you. We'll give you back the true cross, which we took from Jerusalem. We'll do all of that just so we have peace. And Pelagius goes, no, we're not going to accept that. You know, this is probably just a trick. And if it isn't, you're so weak now that we'll easily be able to conquer your entire empire and convert you all to Christianity, right? Because the guy was a complete moron who had no idea what was going on, right? And he threw away this chance, right? Like they could have had everything they wanted. And then, you know, they get stuck in Damietta there for a while. Al-Kamil comes back to them, still offering the exact same peace, right? Even expands a little bit, adds a little bit more territory. And Pelagius says no again, right? And like, they just lose because of this one asshole, right? Like that's something that you're not likely to end up finding, you know, like, and then there's a bunch of other stuff he does. Like Kamil finally says, fuck it. And when they're marching towards Cairo, he removes the blocks on the dams and floods them out, right? And then suddenly they have to march back, and they lose like half of their army being raided by Kamil's forces, right? So finally at the end, they have to be the ones to sue for peace, right? Like, so it's just like a story that it would be very hard for most writers to come up with something that would look quite like that, right? And then there's other things like that too, right? How you have in a history, people don't die at the right moment, right? In a novel, people always die at the moment that's right in the novel, right? Like, you know, you'll die, the hero will die heroically in the battle, right? Or the mentor of the hero dies so that the hero can become the hero, or stuff like that. But in real history, you know, you could have some guy that's kicking ass, right? Richard of York in the War of the Roses, he's kicking ass, he's at his very peak. He gets surprised in one ambush and he's murdered. And then everything falls back into chaos, right? That sort of stuff. You know, you don't see that in fiction. You see it in Game of Thrones a lot because, again, they're inspired by exactly the sort of stuff that happened in the War of the Roses, including characters dying at the wrong moment rather than at what would be the right moment, you know. Tywin Lannister gets shot dead in a bathroom, right? Stuff like that. So history is whether you're writing something or writing a setting, or you're running a campaign, taking inspiration from history is a way to create a campaign that feels much more true to life, right? And what we're doing in role-playing games isn't fiction. It's a simulation of reality. So you want it to feel as real as possible.
Someone with a strange name, D34, said, just to subscribe to RPGPundit's channel after watching your Woke D&D finally hitting Go Broke video.
Wow, thank you very much. I really appreciate everybody who subscribes.
That one is.
I'm also glad to call out Wizards BS. Yeah.
That's a recent one. So what do you think will happen after the next steps on
The
with
D&D
D&D.
one.
Yeah, what will be the effect
Yeah.
of that on OSR and role-playing in general?
As I commented in the video, it's some very interesting stuff is happening in Wizards of the Coast right now. First, D&D is losing money on, especially on print sales, right? The recent woke books are selling badly. But that's actually kind of the sideshow of what's actually going on, though it is an important detail, because if those books had been selling great, then they probably would have made like Jeremy Crawford the head of Wizards, and they didn't, right? And in fact, Ray Winninger got kicked out or left. We don't know exactly which one. He says he left. I don't know. But the person they put in isn't a gamer. It isn't a game designer. It's not a diversity hire. It's a corporate suit from Microsoft, right? That's the person they put in charge of Wizards of the Coast, right? And combined with what we already know about 1D&D, it seems very clear to me that what Wizards is planning to do with the kind of the reset of 5th edition in 1D&D, they're going to switch their focus from being about the tabletop game to being about the virtual game, right? The virtual tabletop and the online gaming, and D&D as a lifestyle brand. They want to especially focus on expanding into other media, right? They have this dream, which I suspect might not work out for them, but you never know, it might, of doing like a bunch of D&D movies and TV shows, right? And getting in on that, right? Making Netflix deals, right? Which sounds a little bit like what Marvel thought it was going to be doing, you know, and how that didn't quite work for them either. And certainly not for DC, obviously. But I think that's what they have in mind. And what they have in mind for D&D is that I think that their whole focus is now going to be not on directing itself towards the traditional base of gamers who play D&D, but directing itself towards people who want to buy micro products on the virtual tabletop, and to people who want to buy lifestyle products. So you're going to have a lot of D&D plushies and D&D shirts and, you know, whatever, D&D perfume, who knows what. There's probably going to be a bunch of D&D cookbooks, because since they've already hired a bunch of diversity hires that only have experience writing cookbooks to write like the Radiant Citadel.
Yeah, but food was also a big part of it, right? There's a lot of food in that book, so that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. For some reason, Wokists always like to write about food, because I think that basically they have very little life experience outside of any of the most basic of human functions. But also, yeah, it's because the people that were writing those adventures had no game design credits. Their qualifications were that they weren't white, and that they were hired because they were friends of Ajit George, right? He just basically got all of his buddies, and it was a make work project for diversity, right? And of course, that's not working out for them. But I suspect that they will still do print products. They just will have very little emphasis on it, and you'll probably have a lot less of them. And instead, what you're going to have is like online products, right? You're going to have like adventures put into the virtual tabletop that you can buy there, and that include like the virtual dungeon or the virtual environment or whatever, and that is like pre-designed for the DM to run, you know, and stuff like that. I think the OSR is from my perspective doing very well, and I think it has the potential to do better because of this. Because if Wizards de-emphasizes the tabletop experience, obviously there are a lot of 5th edition gamers that play online, but it's not the majority of them. I think they're hoping that they're going to get a whole bunch of people to move towards that more and more, but there are obviously going to be a lot of people that are going to move out of that. Now, some of those, because D&D 5th edition is to some extent a fad, right? The people that are there because it's a fad might just stop playing altogether. And then others might move to other systems that aren't OSR. But there's certainly going to be some people that will move towards the OSR. And the more that the OSR keeps making interesting products like the Wretchedverse or like any of my stuff, you know, the more potential there is. I mean, I don't think the OSR is ever going to become like a major contender as a thing, right? Because and it can't be, because it's very decentralized. But I think that there's the opportunity for a lot more people to make significant amounts of money producing good OSR products, right? And to end up kind of doing what I've done, where you can actually make a living off it. You know, that's within the realms of possibility. And I think that the less that Wizards ends up focusing on the pen and paper aspect of the hobby, the more that possibility increases, right? The OSR started out as like an obscure little movement of people making clone books to run old adventures with. But the moment that it had its big boom was when 4th edition happened and 2/3 of D&D players left D&D, right? So the more people that are disillusioned about how Wizards is handling the tabletop aspect of D&D, the more potential that has for the OSR to thrive.
Yeah, I can see probably the young players, the ones they're probably not even playing yet, that's the idea of the virtual world could attract them. But the live tabletop, right, playing at a table, that is what the role-playing games are all about.
Yeah, and I don't think you can underestimate that, right? Like, because it's true, obviously, that younger players, younger people in general, live online, right? Like, so for them, it would be very natural to play online too. But there's also a lot of young people who are intentionally looking to separate from that a little bit in some of the things they do, right? And so I'm sure that there are some people that will want the retro experience of actually sitting around the table with their friends instead of just their friends being on a screen, right? And rolling actual dice on a table, you know? So I certainly think that there's a lot of possibilities for that. It's obvious that the main demographic of the OSR are Gen Xers, but I also know that there are a lot of people that are younger than Gen Xers that are into the OSR at this point. So I don't think that it's going to die with the Gen Xers. You know? I certainly think that there are going to be millennials, and I expect that they're going to probably be, maybe the millennials will be the minoritarian demographic, in that they'll kind of end up skipping it, but that you could probably expect more Gen Z players getting into D&D, and especially if, you know, more Gen Z young people are countercultural to the kind of woke standard of our society, which seems to be increasingly the case. If the products that are official keep being woke products, they're going to look for something else. And being anti-woke is also, to some extent, always connected to a certain degree. Not always, doesn't always mean you're like, what is it, like a dark enlightenment ultra Catholic or something like that. But to some extent, everybody who's anti-woke is at least a little bit traditionalist, right? And so there are people that like doing things the old-fashioned way, right? And that means that also the future of the OSR, I think, is going to continue to be a place that has an anti-woke emphasis, right? There's always going to be certain people that are like pretend to be the woke OSR, but those people are not ever going to be able to capture the core of the OSR.
They don't do much except talking about woke SR.
Yeah, exactly.
But about this go woke and go broke, it is happening, but at the same time they aren't changing. They are still insisting on the woke stuff. If it's not profitable, so why insist on it?
Well, we don't know for sure right now, right? Like we know that outside of RPGs, there's some pushback that's clearly happening, right? Like Warner Brothers got taken over by David Zaslav, and he said, from now on, we're only going to do stuff that actually makes money. And it became very clear that the woke stuff was the stuff that wasn't making money for it, right? So suddenly there's change. But of course, it takes, when you're talking about TV shows or movies, it takes a couple of years of production before that change is noticed, right? Because there's stuff. There are some projects that they might cancel, right? They were going to do a Batgirl movie that they'd spent like $900 million on. They said, fuck it, we're not even going to bother, because it's not worth, it's going to destroy the brand if we put it out, right? It's like worse than The Last Jedi or something, right? So they're changing. There are some other companies that are much slower to change, right? Disney is not apparently changing. But I think that in the case of Hasbro, it's a kind of hopeful sign that they did not promote wokeists into the position. I mean, I'm sure that these people from Microsoft are now in charge of Wizards and Dungeons and Dragons. Like the president of Wizards and the vice president of D&D are both like people from tech companies, right? So I'm sure that they're from Silicon Valley. I'm sure that they vote Democrat, right? But they're neither of them are people who are chosen because they are, you know, Black Lives Matter activists or something like that, or because they're, you know, trans positive activists or anything like that. They were chosen because they know how to sell microtransactions on video games. That's their very clearly, if you look at their curriculum, that's what they're good at, right? And so that's obviously what Wizards wants to do. And in terms of the products, I mean, we're not going to know for sure if Wizards is going to stop going the woke direction for at least a year or so, because again, just like with the movies and TV shows, maybe it's not a 2-year spread, but it's certainly going to be at least a year spread, because usually from the point when a project begins until when a book is released, it's at least that long. So there's right now it's all up in the air. There's kind of 3 possibilities. One is that they will just keep going with putting out woke stuff. One is that they're going to like drastically reduce the number of print books in general, and what they come out with in that case is less likely to be woke. It'll be more likely to be some kind of nostalgic thing, you know, which might have some wokeness in it, right? But it's not going to be Strixhaven, you know, it's not going to be the Radiant Citadel. It's going to be, you know, a Forgotten Realms thing, you know, or something like that. Or there's a chance that they're going to like completely dial down the wokeness because they're saying this is going the wrong direction, right? The problem with RPG, with D&D specifically, is that because 5th edition was so successful, the wokists were able to do a lot of damage for a good while now, right? Like we're talking about since, what is it, like at least since Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, that they started increasing the wokeness, right? Gradually also. They weren't stupid about it. They didn't go like from Tasha's straight to Radiant Citadel, right? They took like 5 books to get there, right? And each one being just a little bit more pushing the boundary than the last. But the last few have apparently not been very well received. And, you know, I think that's going to end up sooner or later, that's going to be reversed, you know, either that or they're just going to stop making books for D&D, or making just occasional special edition reprints or things like that, you know. I'm not sure where we started on this. I kind of lost track there of where we started on this conversation. I think I might have been going to some bigger point, but I kind of forget what it was now.
It started with the video.
Yeah,
video
they
about
go broke.
Yeah.
Oh right, yeah. Well, but you know, they are because of the success of 5th edition, it's taken a lot longer and it's been a lot slower for them to go broke, right? Like comics, you saw a much faster decline for 2 reasons. One, comics were already having problems before the real wokeness started to set in. And the people that took charge, the woke people that took charge, made very sudden, they went from 0 to full retard in 60 seconds, right? They didn't do it quite as gradually. There was actually a lot of cleverness in how the Wizards people, the Wizards wokists, took a series of steps to getting to where they really wanted to get to. And I don't think they're quite there yet. I suspect that this Dragonlance book that's going to come out, that is going to be like the Last Jedi of D&D books, right? It's going to be, because they hate Dragonlance. They fucking despise it, right? Like Dragonlance, for them, is representative of everything wrong, right? It's inspired by Christianity. It's a battle of good and evil, right? It's full of these kind of classical, like 1980s era liberal values, right? That they don't believe in anymore and that they actually consider white supremacy or whatever. It's got problematic races, everything they don't like is in there, right? To the point that they wokists in D&D tried to basically prevent Weiss and Hickman from making the new novel, right? To the point that Weiss and Hickman had to sue them for that novel to come out. And so, and we know that in the Dragonlance RPG book, Weiss and Hickman not only had no part in it, but they weren't even consulted about it, which is the surest sign that what they're going to produce, what's going to come out, is a book that's going to be an intentional brutalization of everything that people that like Dragonlance like about it, right? Like it's going to be meant to do exactly to Dragonlance what The Last Jedi did to Star Wars, which is to say everything about Star Wars is wrong. Everything about the values that it has is wrong. We're going to turn it all on its head. We're going to deconstruct it completely and point out how stupid and horrible it is, and then present you with what is our alternative, which is this, ridiculous woke fantasy, right? And they're going to do that to the Dragonlance book. And I think that one might actually be the bridge too far, right? It might be the point where a whole bunch of people get seriously pissed off about it.
They
Kind of curious.
didn't even get the name right.
Yeah, given.
Yeah, in the advertising material, yeah, I didn't. That was very funny.
I'm kind of curious about that one because I almost started, not quite, but it was one of the first things that I played was a Dragonlance campaign in Dungeons and Dragons, and
Yeah,
was it? I can't remember that. Was Dragonlance started as a game campaign or as a novel? What came first?
well, that's a tricky question. It was started. The first thing that was published was the earliest D&D Dragonlance modules, but it was very clearly that at the same time the book had already been written or was being written, right? So it's in the original D&D modules for Dragonlance, you don't play characters you make yourself, right? You play the characters from the novels, which is really weird. Nobody had ever done that before. But it was like, yeah, you must play these characters, right? You have to be, Raistlin or Tanis Half-Elven or, all these other, the other ones from the Fellowship of the Lance or whatever. And it was basically meant to play out. There are differences between the modules and what the novels actually ended up looking like, but it was clearly that you were playing out the story of the novel. It was happening, roughly speaking, at the same time. So which one came first is kind of dubious, but it was very clear that the intention was to publish the novel, right? And the adventure was set up to give an inroad to it, and the concept was, can we do a D&D world that will also be a place to publish novels with? I think that was like the concept. It was actually quite successful for the initial trilogy, at least.
I quite like it, except for Kenders. The Kenders were nasty.
No, they don't. They're not thieves anymore.
They aren't?
No, they take things out of magical pocket or something like that, right?
Yeah, though I think that there's actually, at least they claim that they're going to backtrack on that, because there was so much. Again, that's a good example, right? There was just so much negative reaction to the Kender thing that even Wizards said, oh, well, we're not going to do that. Okay, we're not going to do it that way, right? But of course they didn't want to make it that Kenders are natural kleptomaniacs, because that, I don't know, Kenders to them are Puerto Ricans or something. I'm not sure what race they think Kenders are, right? But whatever they are, let's say Puerto Ricans, right? That would mean that Puerto Ricans are all thieves, right? I mean, so there's some leftists that must assume that all Puerto Ricans are thieves, and is saying, well, we can't say that about these poor Kender, which are obviously Puerto Rican. So that's the reason, right? It's because they think that fantasy races are actually white supremacy, making negative stereotypes about non-white races, right? Which is bullshit, right? But obviously that's why they said that they didn't want to have a race in there that had something that would be seen as a criminal trait, even though in fact the Kender aren't thieves because they're criminals. They're not thieves because they have a criminal mindset. They're thieves because they're obsessed with shiny things, right? They're like the same way that an animal might be obsessed with a shiny thing.
That strange concept of associating races in role-playing games with real races is kind of strange.
Or ethnies or whatever.
Yeah,
it's to call it.
It's obviously based on nothing. They just decide this.
Orcs are not human.
Yeah, why decide that orcs are black people? Just because, I don't know. Why orcs? Why not some other race? It's kind of strange.
Well, because leftists apparently think black people share traits with orcs, like normal people don't think that, but apparently they do.
Are there some questions here?
No, just but Judd had a question way back that he wanted to ask Pandit what is the most touristy or entertaining
was the
things to do in Uruguay.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, if you are willing to take a bit of risk with your life, you could go watch a soccer game at the Estadio Centenario, which is where the first World Cup was ever held, right? I actually had a friend who came over from Canada earlier this year, and he was really interested in doing this, right? And I said, well, we could try that. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's probably okay. I mean, there is periodic violence that erupts. But then I checked and I saw that the game that was happening while he was here was of like the two most famous soccer teams in Uruguay, Peñarol and Nacional, right? And I know that anytime those two play, right, what they call the Clásico, it's the two gangs of soccer hooligans hate each other with like a passion, right? And crazy shit goes down, right? I was here with this guy, it's like this hapless Canadian, no offense to him, but I mean, like in the sense that he'd never traveled outside of North America before this, right? So he like had no experience of the third world to start with, right? He didn't speak a word of Spanish, right? So I really didn't want to take the risk, and I told him, no, we can't do this. So he was very upset about it. And then like the next day he finds out there was like fires and somebody got shot at. So he said, okay, thank God you didn't take me, right? But aside from that, I mean, obviously if you're a beach person, if you're in Uruguay, they have some of the most amazing beaches in the world, right? Punta del Este and Piriápolis and Cabo Polonio are all like resorts where the rich and famous come to vacation in the summer. 2 out of 3 of those are basically tourist traps, but yeah. There's a lot of wildlife and nature and stuff like that. If you're into that sort of thing, you can go to working ranches and things like that, be a gaucho for a while. There's also, you know, for me, the thing that I find the most fun is the culinary culture in Montevideo. Looking around at the sites in Montevideo, I don't like to travel to go see tourist spots when I go somewhere. I want to immerse myself in the culture. And the culture of Montevideo as a city is really amazing, right? So you can like wander around the city. You can spend days wandering just around the city, looking at things, eating interesting foods, sitting and having coffee in interesting places. There are open air street markets that are really amazing. There's a lot of very interesting historical sites and museums, right? The Colonial Museum, like from the time where the Spanish Virreinato was still in charge here and stuff like that. And modern art, lots of music, lots of culture. And that's the sort of thing I like, right? But I mean, if you're a beach person, you're going to go crazy over the beaches. If you're a nature person, you leave the city, you go out into the countryside, there's tons of interesting things to explore and do there. And the other thing is that now that there are no travel restrictions, you also can like have bonus travel in that from Uruguay, it's a 3-hour ferry ride from Montevideo to Buenos Aires, right? So you can have base camp in Montevideo, which is a much more comfortable city to stay in, but you can like go for a weekend to Buenos Aires, to the city of 15 million people, and enjoy the nightlife there or whatever, you know. So I think there's a lot going for Uruguay, but I don't know. Like, it's not like we don't have the Great Pyramid here or the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty, right? It's not that sort of thing, but it is an opportunity to immerse yourself in a very welcoming culture that's very tourist oriented, because tourism is Uruguay's second biggest industry, right? You'll find there's a lot of people here who speak English. It's very easy to get around. It has one of the lowest crime rates in the Americas, you know, lower crime rate than most US cities these days, you know, certainly. So at least certainly lower crime rate than most of the Democrat-run US cities. So it's a very relaxed kind of place to travel to, you know. But like I said, you can pop over to Buenos Aires and get a bit more excitement if that's what you like.
Joe Coombs is asking about the musical scene in Uruguay.
Well, Uruguay has a long and storied history of musical influence. Arguably, the tango was invented here. Argentinians claim
they stole it.
Carlos Gardel was Uruguayan, although Argentinians claim he's Argentinian. The comparsita, which is the most famous of all the tangos, the one that goes da 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 da. That's Uruguayan, and even the Argentinians can't argue with that, right? Because it was invented in a bar in Montevideo, right? Besides tango, Uruguay has a long history of like folk music and what was called like new folk music, which was usually a very kind of lefty oriented neo-folk that came out in the 60s. Around the same time that in Brazil you were having bossa nova, right? In the Spanish countries you were having what was called the Nueva Canción or Canto Nuevo or that sort of thing, which were folk songs that had a strong political bent, and some of the most famous musicians of that new folk style were from Uruguay that became famous like throughout the Latin American world, right? And then later you've got in Uruguay, it had a period of what was kind of a very uniquely Latin American style of punk, and a kind of Latin American, there's a Latin American sort of popular music that is, I guess it has the same niche in South America that like rap music has, or hip hop in North America, is to say it's the music of the urban poor, which is, it has a number of different names and slight different variations like reggaeton and cumbia, which are very big here along with the rest of South America. And of course, people from the middle classes think of it as like being, oh, this is just horrible, like it's gangster music and it's so unsophisticated.
I hate reggaeton.
So the American, isn't that popular in America?
But in the 1920s, that's what they used to say about tango, right? So who knows, maybe like 80 years from now, you'll have people in suits and ties and women in dresses doing reggaeton, you know, like it'll be the cultured music and they'll be complaining about whatever the next thing is, you know. There's also like rock music that's like, you know, basically trying to copy English language rock music, but that's always horrible. You know, I've always thought that rock music performed by anyone other than English speakers tends to be really bad, you know, unless it's specific musicians who figure out how to do it exactly like English speakers do, right? So like, you know, ABBA or something like that, I guess you could argue have the talent to do it, right? But for the most part, you know, like trying to do a French version of rock music or a Spanish version of rock music or Italian rock, you know, it's just, it's awful. They have their other, you know, whereas other styles of music from non-English countries are incredible, right? But, you know, like if you go to India, you want to listen to either like raga music or banga music or something like that. You don't want to listen to like a bunch of Indian guys trying to copy, you know, to copy Nirvana or something like that. You know, like,
it's basically, I think you're describing Eurovision. There's a lot of European countries trying to imitate.
It's always horrible, you know.
Okay, so I'm getting to be this conversation is interesting, but yeah, I'm starting to get a little bit sleepy.
Yes.
Oh, we've been on for 2 hours now?
Yeah, 2 hours. Yeah, it's 1 p.m. here.
Oh yeah, 1 a.m. even.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that's it.
You can tell they're just sleepy. Well, you know, I guess unless someone has any other questions.
Yeah, this is going on the music. This
Okay,
is
so
going on the music.
if you have something to ask it now.
We have a delay, so let's.
Well, yeah,
let's wait.
Joe Coombs was asking if you tango.
If I tango? No, I don't tango. Tango is a difficult dance to master, you know.
Never tried. I'm not a dancer. Definitely wouldn't try tango.
That's something you can see if you're like, yeah, especially during the summer months, obviously, because that's the tourist season here, which is the winter in North America, right? But you can see in Montevideo, in the areas where tourists tend to frequent, that you'll have like street performers doing tango dancing in public and stuff like that. And, it is quite an impressive dance.
Yeah.
So you live in the capital?
I do, yeah.
Now they're asking if Meatball does, if Meatball tango.
Yeah.
Of course he does. All cats dance.
I just heard her meow here, so she must have heard her name. But no, I don't think she tangos. Also, she's probably too old to tango at this point, but she probably does. She is old enough to complain about reggaeton, you know.
RPG Overviews is saying that once he gets social encounters in print, he'll do a video on it.
Excellent. I'll look forward to seeing it.
But it's already in print, right? I mean,
it is already in print.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, but
available in
it
print
needs to
now.
get there.
yeah, of course. It's taking a lot
can
of
get-
time to.
Social Encounters, you can get it with PDF and print in standard for $12.99 or premium for $14.99. Or if you've already bought the PDF, you can get just the book by itself for $9.99 or $11.99.
Okay, apparently there are no more questions.
I guess that's it for today. Well, thank you for having me on.
Thank you
for
very
coming.
much for coming.
And thanks for everybody, everyone on the chat.
Yeah, they were very active and started.
Well, we were doing a stream at an hour that people can actually watch.
Yeah,
for a change.
that's a problem for us. Usually, when we are streaming, there's not much people watching. They are working or, well, usually working.
RPG Overviews is asking Miguel asking you to pronounce your last name for him.
Okay, I will say it. Ribeiro. I suppose it's not possible for Americans to pronounce it, or English people as well.
But you can pronounce it the Brazilian way. Ribeiro. Exactly.
Or Spanish.
Or Spanish, yes, it's easier.
It's easier. It's the Portuguese way. It's weird. I can't even explain. It's too flat. I think that's the problem. Okay, so thanks for joining us again, and I hope one of these days when you have something, some of your new projects to talk about, you'll come back.
Oh, I will. Thank you very much.
And well, thank you all for coming and asking a few questions, and see you around. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.